Next, we're going to move on to looking at some useful applications. And I think the first thing that we're going to want to talk about is how to add a user to a project, because by default, people can't access any projects. When you have a new REDCap account, you will have no projects accessible. If you created one, like this training project, you could then access that. But how do you start a new project, or how do you invite a collaborator to a project that you've begun, or how do you ask a collaborator to add you to a project? That's where we're going to go to next, and we're going to see that in user rights. Okay, so here I got to this user rights menu just on the left-hand navigation menu under applications, and I went to user rights here. There's a similar but different link called DAGs, or data access groups. We're really just going to deal with the user rights now. Okay, so when I click on this, I can see all of the REDCap usernames of anyone that can access this project. The only one right now is myself, my own account. And I can also see the levels of access and the features that are available to each user that can access this project. So to invite somebody else now, maybe some collaborators to work on this project with me, some members of my team, or so on, I would first need their REDCap username. Typically, a REDCap username is somebody's first name underscore their last name. And if those people are based at George Washington University or the GW Hospital or MFA, they'll typically have a GWU underscore before that. But really, it's easy to just email the person and say, hey, what's your REDCap username? I want to add you to this project. The next thing you'll do is type in their username here. I'm going to just do a quick example. If I type in like John Smith, I think because there's not actually a John Smith in the system right now, it might not let me move to this menu. Okay, it's not going to let me. So that's one check that you could do. Just to walk through this example, I'm going to put in one of the REDCap training accounts. So that would be like RC user 30, for example. And I'm going to pretend that this is an actual person like Jane Doe or John Smith or whoever that I want to invite to this project. So I would type in their username, and then I would say I want to add them with custom rights. And now I can see all of the different user rights that I could give this person. So first I could set an expiration date, and then I can give them access to certain privileges. The three here are really the most important privileges we could discuss. The first is project design and setup. This is a high-level privilege, but it's really needed for anybody that's going to be able to create or build or modify a project. So if you want them modifying or editing instruments and things like that, they're going to need that ability. This user rights ability is really the most powerful ability you can give someone. So be careful giving people access to this feature, because somebody with the ability to modify user rights can also modify their own user rights. So if you gave somebody user rights ability but then gave them no access for data export, theoretically they could open up REDCap, go into their user rights and modify that. So user rights is really probably the highest level privilege in here. So be careful about adding people with that. That should be conserved for really a relatively few permanent members of your team. Then under data exports, you can give no access for data export only de-identified fields, or the full data set. There's also an option to remove the fields that you've tagged as identifiers. And then so on. The rest of the privileges are relatively self-explanatory here, and generally the defaults will do pretty well. But if you want somebody to be able to see the logging trail, you could add that here. If you want them to be able to delete or rename records, you might want to add those abilities. And over on the right hand side here, we can see data rights by instrument. So that's another level of control you can add. If somebody's not going to be involved at all with the physical exam portion, You can maybe give them only read-only access or no access to that part of the project, depending on how your study team's organized. So that's another option here. Okay, so if we add that user, now all of a sudden that next user appears here under user rights, and we could see the different features that they have, and to edit any of those you could click on them and just say edit user privileges. I'll also mention the roles here. These are similar to the same menu we just saw for adding a user, but you can you can create that role and have that as a permanent offering in your project. So for instance, you could have something like data entry person, and you could create that role and you could set those permissions. So maybe this person has no access to project design and setup. They can only export the de-identified data set, and but we're going to let them rename records, for instance. And I'm going to create this role. Now I can more easily add new users, especially if I'm expecting that I'm going to add 5 staff members or students to this role that are going to have these responsibilities in a project. Instead of adding a new user with custom rights every time, I could type in a different person's username. In this case, I'm just going to use another one of the training accounts, RCuser29, and assign them to the role of data entry person. And now, I didn't have to set those rights again every time I want to add somebody to that role. I can just select it from the drop-down list. And you can have multiple roles. Okay, the next thing we're going to want to look at is how to actually view and export the data we've collected in a project. So to do that, again, we're going to go to the left-hand menu under Applications, and we're going to click on Data, Exports, Reports, and Stats. And you can see there's a number of options here. First, let's just say, let's view a report of all the data that we've collected. So similar to what we saw in the record status dashboard, we could see the 3 different record IDs, but now we also see the field labels, the variables, and the answer choices that were selected for each of the completed responses, or partially each of the started responses. Sometimes this will be quite a lot to take in, especially in a big project that could have hundreds of records and maybe hundreds of fields. So we may want to begin by just exporting this report, which we can do by clicking this down arrow, and then you can select some export options. I find that I almost always just want to export the CSV with the raw data, or perhaps including the labels. And then you have some options here. If you have access to identified information, you can also restrict that in this given export. So I could say remove all tagged identifier fields, hash the record ID field, which will convert the record name into a random string of variables. And you could remove date and time stamped fields as well. So let's just leave those for now though. And I'll say export data. I'll get this link. You remember to click here to actually begin the download. And then I can open that on my computer in Excel and view that file. I'm not going to show that right now because I'm just recording this particular window. Okay, so the next thing after doing that export I want to show you is that there's some built-in stats and charts in REDCap that can be pretty helpful. So we'll just select for now the pre-screening instrument, and you could see that REDCap by default just builds some of these nice little plots for us. They're not publication ready figures, but they could be useful for updating at a lab meeting or things like that. So if you wanted to save any of these, you can just click this to link to download the image, save it to your computer. And depending on the types of values you were collecting, the graphs that REDCap will build for you will be a bit different. And you can also choose some options here to view as, for instance, a bar chart or a pie chart. Okay, another thing that's really useful in this application of data exports, reports, and stats is the ability to make custom reports. So let's take a look at how to do that. we can get there by clicking on this Create New Report tab, or by just starting from Data Exports, Reports, and Stats on the left-hand menu. So by default, we have reports for all data, or we have selected instruments. We can also create a custom report, and this is really useful for following subsets of your study subjects and doing a variety of things. So first, you can give your report any name. One option of something that can be useful is like new enrollments, and you can and I'll give that a date too, like new enrollments April 2020. And now you can select what fields you want to be in this report. So you can do from like the drop down list. First, you could quick add and just select all of the different fields you might want, all the way up through all fields, or maybe you just want some specific things like record ID, date of birth, sex, break age, and height and weight. And I'll close those. So now those fields have been added to the report. And in this case, I'm saying this is like a new enrollment report, just to give you an example of something you might want to do. And I'm going to create a filter here by saying I only want people to appear in this report if they were enrolled in this project after a certain date. So in this case, I didn't record a date in pre-screening or follow-up. If I had wanted to actually track those things, I probably should have. But I do have a PE date here. So in this case, I could say, only if the PE date was after April 1st, 2020, do I want them to show up in this report. So I created that report, and I'm viewing it now, and this is showing, okay, there's been no new responses since that time period. But as soon as new people were added in the month of April, they would show up here. So just to show you that, I'll go to the record status dashboard. I'll take this record ID 1, and I'll set the physical exam as if it was today. We'll say this person had everything normal. Mark this form as complete, save and exit. Okay, now we see pre-screening and physical exam was both done for record ID 1. Also, notice now I have a new report that shows up on the left-hand menu. Now that we have our first custom report, it shows up here, easy to get to from anywhere. We could click on that, and now we see, okay, one record has passed that filter that we set in place for new enrollments in April. Okay, so you could do that to track all sorts of things. You could create a new report to show, for instance, if you wanted to track people that were pregnant in a separate report or so on, you could add filters in place in this step 2 area, in the step 3 area to include a filter for any value based on the report. So, if you wanted to do, are you pregnant, and say only if people said yes, should they appear in this new report, you could do that and create a new one. I'm just going to cancel this for now. Okay, so those are the reports and stats. One last thing about the reports, it's very useful to create these reports also just for exporting data. So if you have a big project with many, many fields, you might not want to export all of your data from all of those fields all the time. If you just want to do some quick analyses based on, age distribution or other things, you can create a report just for those, and then anytime you want to export that data, you don't have to select all the fields again. You can just say export that report, and that's only going to include the subset of fields you wanted in that particular report. So that's another useful way to subset a large project for exporting the data for some analysis.